June 1942. The Pacific lies stretched to the horizon, silent and endless, an ocean holding its breath, suspended between victory and collapse. In its center, 4 Japanese carriers cut through the water with cold precision. On their flight decks, mechanics hurry between open fuel lines, stacks of bombs, and aircraft half-armed for the next strike. Steel tools clatter, engines cough, and men move with the confidence of an empire that has not tasted defeat. They do not know it yet, but they are preparing their own disaster. Far above and far away, almost too far to matter, stray groups of American dive bombers fight the wind and the clock. They are not a perfect formation. They are fragments. Survivors. Pilots who should already be heading home. Men flying on fumes, chasing a target they haven't even confirmed exists. Still, they press on. The sun burns against their canopies. Their engines rumble with a stubborn, almost personal anger. A pilot glances down at a fuel gauge kissing zero. Another tightens his grip on a crumpled, hand-drawn map, more hope than navigation. Ahead of them, only open ocean. Nothing else. Until something shifts. A glint. A shape. A smear of color where none should be. And then, as if the world suddenly decides to reveal its secret, 3 Japanese carriers rise from the horizon, wide open, decks cluttered, utterly exposed. A clock starts ticking. The American pilots roll into their dives. The Pacific holds its breath. 3 minutes. That is all. 3 minutes that will separate defeat from resurgence, disaster from opportunity, domination from collapse. 3 minutes that will redraw the entire map of the Pacific War. And when the first American bomb falls, the Japanese still have no idea that their invincibility is already gone. In the next heartbeat, the most decisive sound of the naval war will not be a torpedo or a gun, but the scream of dive bombers cutting through the sky toward an impossible target. 3 minutes of fire. 3 minutes that will shatter an empire. June 1942 was not merely another month in the Pacific, it was a breaking point. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had advanced in every direction, moving with a precision that stunned the world. The rising sun swept through Southeast Asia, crushed fortress after fortress, and expanded across thousands of miles with a speed that few believed possible. American forces were reeling. The Philippines were gone. Wake Island had fallen. The British had been driven out of Malaya and Singapore. The Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable, an industrial machine powered by discipline, doctrine, and an elite naval aviation corps that had been training for 20 years. Yet behind this seemingly perfect advance, a flaw was growing. Japan was expanding too far, too fast, and its naval staff believed the United States, battered and humiliated, would negotiate rather than fight a long war. That assumption shaped every Japanese plan, including the next one, the capture of Midway Atoll. Midway was tiny. Nothing more than 2 small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by reefs and deep water. But its value was immense. It sat at a crucial crossroads of the Pacific, a forward outpost that allowed the U.S. Navy to project reconnaissance, launch bombers, and guard the approaches to Hawaii. To Japan, destroying Midway meant eliminating America's last forward position and luring the U.S. carriers into a decisive ambush. To Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, this would be the knockout blow America would not recover from. But the Japanese were unaware of one critical truth. The Americans had already broken their code. Inside a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rockefort had cracked enough of the Japanese naval cipher, JN-25, to read portions of their communications. The breakthrough was fragile, incomplete, and full of gaps, but it was enough to reveal a name repeated again and again. AF. A target. But which one? The U.S. Navy suspected Midway, but they needed proof. So they sent a message from the island in plain text, "Midway is short on fresh water," and waited. A few hours later, the Japanese reported, "AF is low on fresh water." Confirmation. The trap had been turned inside out. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and analytical, made a decision that would change the course of the war. He would not wait for the Japanese attack. He would ambush the ambush. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, would sail to a point northeast of Midway and wait, hidden in the vastness of the ocean. The stage was set. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And in a few days, everything would converge on a moment so brief, so unlikely, that historians still struggle to believe it truly happened. 3 minutes. The 3 minutes that Block 3 will begin to chase. The American carriers slipped into the North Pacific like shadows, silent, unseen, and dangerously alone. Nimitz had placed them at Point Luck, a position chosen with almost surgical precision. It was a gamble of the highest order, 3 carriers against 4 of Japan's elite. Yet the location gave the U.S. one advantage Japan did not expect: initiative. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet carried the bulk of the striking force: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Their decks trembled with the weight of the aircraft, each one a small island of metal and hope. The crews moved with practiced rhythm, but beneath the discipline there was tension. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone knew how much depended on timing. And then there was the Yorktown. Barely repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, she sailed with patched decks, welded plates still cooling, and technicians working non-stop in corridors that smelled of fresh paint and burned insulation. She should have been in dry dock. Instead, she was heading straight into one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Above the decks, the sea wind carried the smell of oil and steel. Below, in the planning rooms, captains studied charts covered in thin pencil lines, wind directions, timing forecasts, estimated Japanese flight rotations, predicted carrier positions. War in the Pacific was not chaos, it was mathematics, logistics, and nerve. On June 3, reconnaissance planes from Midway made first contact with the approaching Japanese invasion force. But this was not the carrier strike group, the one that mattered most. That force, led by the experienced Admiral Nagumo, remained hidden behind the curvature of the earth, moving with the confidence of a fleet accustomed to winning. As night fell, the American carriers maintained radio silence. Lights were dimmed. The ships became dark silhouettes sliding across the water as the Pacific breathed beneath them. Pilots tried to sleep but couldn't. Mechanics worked quietly in the hangars. Commanders rehearsed scenarios with no reassurance that any of them would match reality. Then dawn approached, June 4th. From the bridge of the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance looked out at a horizon dissolving into pink and orange. His decision was already made. He would launch early, before visual confirmation, before certainty, before everything was perfectly aligned. The logic was simple and brutal. Whoever struck first would shape the battle. Spruance knew the Japanese would launch their first wave against Midway at sunrise. That meant the decks of their carriers would be crowded with aircraft loaded for a land strike. Bombs, not torpedoes. It was the moment of greatest vulnerability. But only if the Americans could find them in time. So at 7 a.m., while the sun still hovered low, the order echoed across the decks. Launch the attack. Engines roared awake. Propellers blurred to life. The sky above Point Luck suddenly filled with the thunder of dozens of aircraft lifting into the morning air. It was the beginning of a desperate race, one fought not in miles, but in minutes. Because if the Americans arrived too early, they would strike an empty ocean. If they arrived too late, the Japanese would have rearmed, refueled, and closed the window forever. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were preparing their next move. And the clock that would lead to those 3 minutes had finally begun to run. Before the American carrier planes even reached cruising altitude, another battle had already begun. Midway, small, isolated, vulnerable, was about to unleash everything it had. At dawn, spotters on the atoll saw dark shapes approaching from the northwest. The warning came through with calm urgency. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. The Japanese first wave was coming. On the runways of Eastern Island, American ground crews scrambled to arm B-20 AXS, B-17s, and Marine Corps dive bombers. None of these aircraft were ideal for attacking a carrier strike group, but the defenders had no choice. Midway was not designed to break a fleet. It was designed to survive long enough for the carriers to strike. Engines roared awake, sand and salt swirling through the air as the first American planes climbed into the sky. Their orders were simple, almost hopeless. Find the Japanese carriers and attack. No matter what. At 6:16 a.m., Japan struck first. Waves of A-6M0s and Nakajima B-5NS screamed over Midway's defenses. Bombs tore through fuel tanks, smashed buildings, and sent columns of fire rising. The ground shook. Anti-aircraft guns barked back, filling the air with black bursts of shrapnel. Marines fought to keep their heads down as the sky itself seemed to fall apart. But amid the chaos, the American planes kept going. The first attack group from Midway found Nagumo's carriers and charged directly into one of the deadliest anti-aircraft umbrellas ever assembled. Japanese fighters tore through them with devastating accuracy. Torpedo bombers were cut down one after another. The sea swallowed burning aircraft, leaving only oil-slick scars on the water. It was a massacre, and yet, it mattered. Because while the Japanese pilots focused on destroying these incoming attackers, they burned fuel and time. Their defensive formations stretched thin. Their flight decks, busy recovering aircraft, remained cluttered and exposed. Nagumo, believing no American carriers were near, prepared for a second strike on Midway. His crews began rearming aircraft below deck, switching weapons, refueling lines, stacking bombs in preparation for a land attack loadout. It was the most dangerous moment imaginable for any carrier. Open fuel lines. Bombs on lifts. Racks of ammunition scattered across steel floors. Planes being pushed, repaired, corrected. A floating powder keg. If an enemy found them now, even one bomb could ignite a chain reaction capable of destroying an entire ship. But Nagumo felt safe. His scouts had seen nothing. His Zeros were controlling the air. Midway was burning. And the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, still held the advantage. At least on paper. Because at that very moment, far beyond sight, the American dive bombers were struggling to locate them, running low on fuel, flying blind over an ocean too large to comprehend. Everything was still uncertain. Everything was still moving toward disaster. But the pieces were falling into place. The defenders of Midway had bled for minutes. To buy seconds. Seconds Nagumo didn't yet realize he had lost. Seconds the Americans desperately needed to find their target. The 3 minutes were getting closer. The greatest danger in the Pacific was not enemy fire. It was emptiness. The ocean stretched beyond imagination, blue, silent, indifferent. Finding a moving carrier group in that vastness was like trying to strike a match in a hurricane and hoping someone, somewhere, would see the flame. By mid-morning, the American strike groups launched from Enterprise and Hornet were already scattered. Strong winds, navigational errors, and rushed takeoffs had torn the formations apart. Squadrons were separated by miles, sometimes by entire horizons. Radio silence only made it worse. Many pilots no longer knew where the carriers were. Some no longer knew where they were. Fuel gauges kept dropping. Maps were useless. Compass headings drifted. The Pacific had swallowed fleets before. It was close to swallowing these men too. In the cockpit of a dauntless dive bomber, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey studied the empty sea with mounting urgency. He was leading Enterprise's main attack group, and every minute without contact brought him closer to a disaster no bomb could prevent: fuel starvation. The men behind him could see it too. The sun glared off the waves. The sky looked endless. But the Japanese fleet remained invisible. Time was running out. McCluskey had a choice: turn back and save his pilots, or press forward and risk losing them all. He pressed forward. Below them, the ocean shifted ever so slightly, thin white lines cutting across the blue. Wakes. But not from carriers. McCluskey pulled his Dauntless into a wide turn. Destroyers. 2 of them. And they were running at full speed. Destroyers didn't sprint unless they were trying to catch up. Or rejoin something larger. It was a clue. A small one. But in the Pacific, small clues were gold. McCluskey followed their course. Minutes passed. Fuel dropped. No carriers appeared. Then the horizon flickered. Shapes. Smoke. Movement. The Japanese fleet. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, spread across the ocean in a perfect, impossible alignment. Their decks were packed with planes being refueled and rearmed. Bombs lay exposed on carts. Crewmen ran between aircraft with hoses and tools. They were open, defenseless, unprepared. And McCluskey had found them at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. But the window would not stay open long. Japanese aircraft were already forming to defend. Zeros climbed from the carriers, racing to intercept. The sky would soon turn lethal. McCluskey checked his fuel, dangerously low. He didn't care. He looked back at his squadron, raised his arm, and signaled the attack. The dive brakes opened. The Dauntless tipped forward. And gravity took over. What had begun as a desperate search had turned, in an instant, into the strike that would shape the outcome of the Pacific War. The 3 minutes were almost here. Before McCluskey's dive bombers began their deadly descent, another group of Americans had already faced the Japanese carriers, and paid an unimaginable price. Torpedo Squadron 8. VT-8. Flying obsolete TBD Devastators, slow, under-armored, and carrying torpedoes that often failed on impact. They launched from the USS Hornet hours earlier, heading on a course that would take them far south of the Japanese fleet. Without fighter escort. Without support. Without even the certainty that they were flying in the right direction. When they finally sighted the Japanese carriers, their fuel was nearly gone. But their mission was clear: attack anyway. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, the squadron leader, signaled his men. No speeches. No hesitation. Just a silent turn into the jaws of the enemy. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, elite A6M0s, fell upon them immediately. The Devastators had a top speed barely above stall for a 0. They flew low and straight, lining up on the carriers, giving the enemy every advantage. Japanese pilots dove from above, crossing behind them in blistering passes. Tracers stitched through canvas wings. Fuel tanks ruptured. Cockpits exploded in flame. One by one, the Devastators fell. Still, they pressed on. Still, they attempted torpedo drops that had almost no chance of success. Still, they flew into the storm. Waldron's voice crackled over the radio minutes before he was shot down. "My boys, follow me." None of VT-8's 15 aircraft returned. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the ocean, watching the smoke rise. And yet, this massacre achieved something no calculation had predicted. It pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level. Zeros burned fuel. Their altitude advantage disappeared. Their formation broke as they chased the torpedo planes. And when the last Devastator fell into the Pacific, the Japanese air patrol was scattered, disorganized, out of position, and dangerously low. They were not ready for what was coming next. Because at that exact moment, 2 more torpedo squadrons arrived, VT-6 from the Enterprise and VT-3 from the Yorktown. They met the same fate as VT-8, charging toward the carriers through a curtain of fire. Their attack runs failed. Planes fell burning. Crews were lost. But their sacrifice did something crucial. They kept the Japanese eyes looking down. They kept the decks crowded. They kept the sky open above. And above them, unseen and unopposed, high in the sunlight, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers were beginning to arrive. The Japanese had no idea the real threat was not at sea level. It was directly above their heads. The 3 minutes were seconds away. High above the chaos, so high the pilots could barely see the ocean through the glare, Wade McCluskey's dive bombers reached the point of no return. The sky was quiet up here. Too quiet. Below them, the torpedo squadrons had been torn apart, streaks of fire on the sea, smoke drifting like dark scars across the water. But from this altitude, the American pilots couldn't see individual planes fall. They only saw flashes, bursts, small eruptions of flame, and then nothing. The Japanese fighters were gone, drawn low by the torpedo attacks, chasing kills they assumed would be the final blows in another Japanese victory. But they had left the upper sky unguarded. McCluskey looked down and saw it. 3 Japanese carriers, almost motionless from this height, their long flight decks bristling with aircraft and crews. Planes were packed wing to wing. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar. Bombs sat exposed on carts. Everything was open. It was the kind of opportunity pilots trained for their entire lives but never expected to see. An enemy caught mid-rearm, mid-refuel, mid-decision. Below deck, the Japanese were preparing for a second strike against Midway. Mechanics worked furiously. Ammunition crews were stacking 250-kilogram bombs. Hoses pumped gasoline into waiting aircraft. The carriers were floating factories in full production mode. And McCluskey understood instantly. If a single bomb hit the right place, the entire ship would erupt. He keyed his mic. Dive bombers, attack. The formation broke. Dive brakes extended like steel wings. Noses dropped. And then the sky turned into a screaming plunge. The Dauntless fell from 14,000 feet, slicing downward at nearly vertical angles. The wind howled around the cockpits. The ocean spun upward in a blur of blue. Pilots fought trembling controls, holding the exact dive path they had practiced endlessly on calm training days that now felt like a different lifetime. Japanese lookouts spotted them too late. Alarms sounded. Crews scrambled. Fighters tried to climb, but they were too far, too low, too late. Zero pilots pushed throttles forward in desperation, engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. But they would never reach the Americans in time. McCluskey selected his target, the carrier Kaga. He tightened his dive. His bombs armed. The deck of the Japanese ship expanded in his gun sight, growing larger with terrifying speed. The Dauntless was stable, elegant even, in its lethal descent. McCluskey held his breath. He released his bomb. The aircraft jolted upward as the payload dropped away. He pulled hard on the stick, blacking out for a split second as the G-forces punched into his chest. Behind him, his squadron followed, one bomb after another falling like a chain of fate. And in that moment, as the Dauntless pulled out of their dives, the world held still. 3 minutes were about to begin. The minutes that would destroy 3 carriers. The minutes that would turn the Pacific upside down. The minutes that would end Japan's naval dominance forever. The dive was over. The reckoning was about to start. The first bomb hit like a hammer, striking the spine of the Kaga. It tore through the flight deck, plunging into the hangar below, where fuel lines lay open, bombs sat stacked for the next strike, and crews were rushing to rearm aircraft. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. A blast of superheated air rolled through the hangar like a storm of fire. On deck, men were thrown off their feet. Planes ignited in violent flashes. Flames leapt through open hatches, feeding on gasoline vapor that had nowhere to escape. In seconds, the Kaga transformed from a weapon of war into a furnace. But the Americans were not done. More Dauntless plunged toward the carrier's midsection. A second bomb struck near the island. A third ripped through the aft deck. Each explosion fed the next, as if the ship itself were tearing apart from the inside. Ammunition cooked off in rapid bursts. Fireballs tore through the interior decks. Steel warped. Hoses melted. Flight crews ran blindly into smoke thick enough to suffocate in seconds. The Kaga was dying. And this was only the beginning. To the northeast, another division of Dauntless, led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, sighted the Akagi, flagship of the Japanese carrier strike force. Akagi's decks were just as vulnerable, aircraft mid-refuel, bombs on carts, torpedoes being moved into position. Best began his dive, fighting to line up a near-impossible shot on the narrow aft portion of the flight deck. He released one bomb. One. It struck with deadly precision, penetrating through 2 decks before exploding amid fuel tanks and armed aircraft. The blast ripped through Akagi's hangar, igniting a chain reaction that turned the ship into a blazing inferno. Flames blasted from elevator shafts. The flight deck buckled. Crewmen, blinded and burned, tried to organize a response, but the fire spread too fast. A few hundred meters away, the Soryu suffered the same fate. 3 bombs found her deck in rapid succession, triggering catastrophic fires that roared through the hangars like a tidal wave of heat. Planes exploded. Bulkheads collapsed. The engine room filled with smoke so thick it smothered men at their stations. 3 carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were burning at the same time. And all of it happened in less than 3 minutes. The Japanese commanders were stunned. The bridge crews watched their own carriers engulfed in fire, unable to comprehend how the battle had reversed so completely, and so quickly. Moments earlier, they had believed victory was certain. Now, the horizon around them was filled with pillars of flame and rolling black smoke. Nagumo's strike force, Japan's elite navy, the same arm that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was shattered before it could launch its second wave. The Pacific had flipped in an instant. The 3 minutes were over. But the battle was not. Because one Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still intact, still armed, still dangerous. And she was preparing to strike back. The ocean hissed with smoke and fire. 3 Japanese carriers, once symbols of dominance, now listed in flames, their black plumes rising thousands of feet into the Pacific sky. But one remained untouched. Hiryu. Under the command of the relentless Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, Hiryu stood like a solitary blade in a battlefield of ruins. She was untouched, unshaken, and fully capable of launching a counterstrike. Her flight deck was clear. Her aircraft were ready. Her pilots, among the most experienced in the world, were fueled by shock, fury, and discipline. Yamaguchi understood the stakes. If he hesitated, the battle would be lost. If he struck now, he might still turn the tide. He chose to attack. At 10:50 a.m., Hiryu launched her first wave, dive bombers armed with 250-kilogram bombs. They climbed into the sky with practiced precision, banking toward the faint columns of smoke rising from Point Luck, where the American carriers were hidden beyond the horizon. Below, the U.S. task force scanned the skies. The crews knew the Japanese would not surrender the battle. Radar operators aboard the Yorktown watched their screens with nervous intensity. Then, blips. Approaching fast. General quarters. The Yorktown prepared for impact. As the first Japanese bombers arrived overhead, American fighters rose to meet them. F-4F Wildcats tangled with Zeros in brutal spirals of smoke and vapor trails. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the air with black bursts that shook the decks. But Hiryu's pilots were relentless. Through the chaos, they broke through the defensive screen and dove on the Yorktown. Their accuracy was devastating. At 12:05 p.m., the first bomb struck. It punched through the flight deck just forward of the island. The explosion ripped holes through multiple decks and ignited fires in the compartments below. Flames spread. Officers shouted orders. Damage control teams rushed forward, dragging hoses across burning steel. Yorktown shuddered, but she did not fall. Her crew fought with extraordinary discipline, sealing compartments, pumping out water, smothering fires. Within minutes, the smoke thinned. The deck stabilized. And in an act of defiance that stunned even the Japanese later, Yorktown launched more fighters, while still smoldering. Then the second wave arrived. Hiryu launched torpedo bombers, Nakajima B-5NS, each carrying a torpedo designed to punch through armored hulls. They flew low, skimming the waves, approaching Yorktown from opposite sides to overwhelm the defenses. The carrier swung hard to dodge. The sea boiled with splashes from near misses. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed. But 2 torpedoes struck home. Yorktown listed sharply. Alarms blared. Steam vented from ruptured pipes. The carrier began to slow, drifting like a wounded giant. Still, she refused to sink. Her crew kept her alive with brute will, counter-flooding compartments, fighting fires, reinforcing bulkheads. Yorktown had become a floating symbol of American resolve. But she was out of the fight. The Japanese had struck back with precision and fury. Hiryu had delivered a blow that echoed across the Pacific. Yet the strike came with a cost. Every aircraft Hiryu launched depleted her strength. Every pilot she lost was irreplaceable. And even as her planes returned to refuel, the Americans were already preparing a counterstrike of their own. Yorktown was wounded. But she was not the only ship capable of answering. The battle was entering its final act, and Hiryu was about to stand alone against two American carriers closing in for the kill. Smoke still drifted from the wounded Yorktown as she fought to stay afloat, but the American fleet did not break formation. The battle was far from over, and there were still two fully operational carriers in the fight, Enterprise and Hornet. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Air Group Commander C. Wade McCluskey knew the window was narrow. Hiryu's air groups were formidable, but they had already expended pilots, fuel, and precious time. Every minute spent refueling or rearming on her deck was another minute of vulnerability. American scouts were searching desperately for Hiryu's position. Smoke from the burning Japanese carriers clouded the horizon, creating confusion, distortions, false sightings. Pilots strained their eyes, scanning for the telltale rectangular outline of a carrier deck cutting through the water. Then, confirmation. A scout plane from the Enterprise sighted Hiryu around mid-afternoon, still launching and recovering aircraft, still fighting with everything she had. The report came in crisp and urgent. Single enemy carrier. Course 335. Speed 25 knots. It was all the Americans needed. Spruance gave the order instantly. Prepare the strike. On the flight decks, dauntless dive bombers were armed and fueled with hurried precision. Oil-stained mechanics slammed panels shut, tightened bolts, checked hoses. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, securing harnesses with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline and exhaustion. They had flown once already. Some had barely made it back. Others had watched friends vanish into the sea. Now they were going again. The engines roared in staggered waves as the aircraft taxied into position. The Pacific wind whipped across the deck. Plane handlers signaled with gloved hands. The entire ship vibrated under the thunder of radial engines. Then, one by one, the Dauntless surged forward and lifted into the sky, banking west toward their final target of the day. From the cockpit of his SBD, Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who had already helped destroy the Akagi, studied the horizon. He knew this attack might decide everything. Hiryu was the last threat capable of sinking American carriers. If she survived to launch another wave, the cost could be catastrophic. The strike group climbed to altitude, tightening formation as they crossed the shimmering expanse of the Pacific. Beneath them, the ocean reflected the late afternoon sun like a sheet of burning gold. Ahead, a column of smoke marked the dying ships of the Japanese task force. But beyond that smoke, moving fast, stood their final objective. Hiryu. She cut through the waves with determination, her flight deck alive with activity, crews dragging hoses, rearming aircraft, clearing debris, preparing for another strike that might never come. American dive bombers formed up above the clouds. The sun dipped low. The horizon glowed red. Best keyed his mic. All aircraft, prepare to dive. The pieces were set. The sky was theirs. And the last carrier of Nagumo's strike force was about to face the weight of an entire fleet. The battle was reaching its final turning point, and the fate of Hiryu would be sealed in the attack that was just minutes away. Late afternoon light washed across the Pacific, turning waves into molten silver as the American strike group approached its target. High above the ocean, the dauntless dive bombers tightened their formation, engines humming in steady, disciplined rhythm. And then they saw her. Hiryu, sleek, determined, cutting through the sea at full speed like a predator refusing to accept defeat. She was the last surviving carrier of the once mighty Japanese striking force, and her deck was alive with movement. Crews worked frantically to prepare more aircraft. Fuel hoses lay across the planks. Bomb carts rattled over steel. Mechanics shouted orders through the roar of engines warming for launch. Richard Best scanned the carrier from 14,000 feet. He understood the truth instantly. Hiryu was doing exactly what the Americans had hoped she would do: prepare another strike. And that meant she was vulnerable. The American formation split into sections with whip-crack precision. The Dauntless spread wide, forming attack lanes that spiraled down toward their target like the spokes of a burning wheel. Best inhaled once, deep and steady. He lowered his dive brakes. The signal passed through the formation like a breath of wind. And then the sky broke open. Dozens of Dauntless rolled forward into near-vertical dives. The sudden plunge pressed pilots against their harnesses, the wind screaming around the canopies. Altimeters unwound at terrifying speed. The ocean surged upward in a dizzying blur. The Japanese lookouts spotted them too late. Alarms sounded. Zeros scrambled to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, spraying the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. But it was chaos. Some Japanese gunners fired too high. Others fired too low. The Dauntless were already committed, already locked into dives too steep to evade. From the bridge of the Hiryu, officers watched in stunned disbelief as the American bombers fell toward them like meteors. Best lined up his sights, his target the narrow center of the flight deck. He steadied the stick. He held the dive, even as the carrier grew dangerously large in his gun sight. At 2,000 feet, he released. The bomb dropped cleanly, slicing through the air with a whistling roar. Best pulled up hard, his Dauntless shaking violently as it clawed out of the dive. He blacked out for a heartbeat, then came back to consciousness just in time to see the explosion. A perfect hit. The bomb punched through Hiryu's deck, detonating deep inside the hangar, where fuel, aircraft, and munitions lay exposed. A geyser of flame burst upward, splitting the deck open. Fire raced across the ship in glowing rivers of gasoline. Then came the second hit. And the third. Explosions erupted across the flight deck. Planes were hurled into the ocean. Crewmen were knocked off their feet, their silhouettes swallowed by fire and smoke. The carrier staggered under the force of the blasts, slowing, drifting, her proud bow dipping as internal compartments collapsed. Hiryu fought back, damage crews running toward the flames with hoses and extinguishers, but the fires were too intense. Fuel lines ruptured. Ammunition cooked off in rolling thunder. Smoke poured from shattered elevators. Within minutes, the last operational Japanese carrier was mortally wounded. From above, the American pilots could see the truth. Hiryu was dying. Yet even as she burned, she refused to sink. Her crew fought the flames with unbelievable courage. Her flag still flew. Her engines still churned, pushing her forward through a haze of fire and steam. But the battle was over. Hiryu, the last sword of the Japanese strike force, would burn until nightfall, her fate sealed in the span of just a few devastating minutes. The Pacific had shifted. The balance of the war had changed. And the Empire of Japan had lost the core of its naval air power in a single day. Evening settled slowly over the Pacific, casting long shadows across a sea littered with debris, oil slicks, and the fading echoes of the most consequential naval battle of the war. The fires aboard Hiryu still burned, throwing orange reflections across the waves like the dying glow of a forge. Her crew fought with ferocity, shouting commands, dragging hoses, sealing bulkheads that buckled moments later under heat so intense it warped steel. They refused to abandon their ship. On the horizon, the black pillars rising from Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu drifted together into a dark wall of smoke that blotted out the sun. Where four proud carriers once stood, now there were only shadows, flames, and twisted silhouettes slowly succumbing to the sea. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet looked small. Far to the east, the American carriers regrouped. The Enterprise and Hornet maintained a cautious formation, their decks scarred by the day's operations but still fully functional. The Yorktown, though crippled, remained afloat, an act of stubborn defiance that kept her crew working through exhaustion and fumes, patching holes, pumping out seawater, and reinforcing weakened beams. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance studied the smoke rising from the west. He knew the truth. The Americans had struck with precision and timing no plan could have guaranteed. But they also understood something more sobering. The battle was not yet over. Twilight in the Pacific was dangerous. Carriers became silhouettes. Aircraft became invisible. And a desperate opponent, cornered, wounded, could still lash out. Spruance refused to risk his fleet in a night surface action. Japanese destroyers and cruisers were lethal in close quarters, and their commanders were experienced in night combat. Instead, he chose caution, maintain distance, hold the advantage, and strike again only with certainty. As darkness fell, the American pilots returned home. Some limped back with holes torn through their wings. Some landed with engines coughing their last breaths. Others simply did not return. On the flight deck, crews waited, counting the silhouettes approaching. Each missing plane meant an empty spot on the roster, and a story that would never be told. Mechanics, ordnance handlers, and deck officers paused each time another Dauntless touched down, letting out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Above the low rumble of engines cooling in the night air, the quiet voices of squadron leaders carried across the deck as they checked in their remaining men. No cheers. No celebration. Just relief, and the haunting weight of the cost paid. The Pacific evening turned colder. The sky deepened to violet. Stars emerged over a battlefield still glowing with pockets of fire. Far to the west, Hiryu's flames flickered against the darkening horizon. Her crew continued to fight the inferno, their silhouettes moving through smoke that glowed like embers. But even they knew the truth. The great carrier had lost too much. Her engines were failing. Her flight deck was ruined. Her compartments were collapsing under the relentless heat. Midway had shifted from the chaos of battle to the stillness that follows catastrophe, a moment when both sides begin to understand what has been gained and what has been lost. Night was falling. The battle's fury had passed. But the reckoning, strategic, human, and historical, was only beginning. Night closed over the Pacific like a curtain, hiding the scars of the battle beneath a vast, indifferent sky. But the darkness did not bring peace. It brought questions, hundreds of them, whispering through every ship still afloat. On the American side, the carriers ran with dimmed lights, silent and cautious. Their crews kept to battle stations, scanning the sea for silhouettes of Japanese cruisers and destroyers that might slip through the night. The Americans knew the Japanese excelled in nocturnal combat. A single misstep could turn the tide all over again. But the ocean remained quiet. Only the distant glow of burning ships marked where the great Japanese striking force had once stood. To the west, the Hiryu fought for her life. Her deck was twisted and melted, her elevators jammed in place, her interior filled with smoke that drifted through every corridor. Below decks, engineers worked with cloths over their mouths, crawling through heat so intense it blistered exposed skin. They refused to abandon their positions. They refused to yield their ship. Admiral Yamaguchi walked the deck in the dim, flickering light of the flames. His uniform was scorched. His officers tried to persuade him to evacuate, to transfer to a cruiser that still had functioning engines. He declined. Hiryu was his command. He would not leave her. Back east, aboard the Enterprise, reports came in from scouts and codebreakers. The scale of the destruction was becoming clear. 3 Japanese carriers confirmed burning and sinking, 1 still aflame, air groups decimated. It was the kind of loss that could cripple a navy, not for months, but for years. Yet Spruance did not celebrate. He knew the enemy fleet was still out there, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers capable of launching a nighttime retaliation. So he chose patience. The American task force shifted course, placing distance between themselves and the drifting battlefield. Destroyers screened the perimeter. Radar operators remained at their stations, watching for even the smallest movement. Inside the ready rooms, pilots who had flown 2, sometimes 3 sorties in a single day slumped against bulkheads, still in their flight gear. Sweat, smoke, and exhaustion clung to them like a second skin. Some slept sitting upright. Others stared into nothing, replaying dives and impacts in their minds, moments too fast to fully grasp, too violent to forget. Aboard Yorktown, the struggle continued. The wounded carrier listed, her deck tilted, her interior filled with the smell of burned insulation and seawater. Damage control crews labored through the night, battling leaks, reinforcing bulkheads, keeping pumps running. Their ship was dying slowly, but not quietly. On Midway Atoll itself, streaks of fire on the western horizon illuminated the night sky. Marines and airmen stood on the beach, watching distant flames flicker like warning lights on the edge of the world. They did not know the details, but they could sense the shift. Something enormous had broken out there in the dark. And aboard the Japanese flagship Yamato, far from the immediate fighting, the news filtered in bit by bit. Officers listened in stunned silence as reports confirmed the impossible. 4 carriers, Nagumo's core strike force, were gone or doomed. Men stared at the floor. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their fists, unable to reconcile the day's events with a navy they believed invincible. The Pacific was dark. But a new reality was beginning to take shape beneath that darkness. Japan's strongest sword had been shattered. And in the quiet that followed, both sides felt the weight of what dawn would reveal. The first light of June 5th crept over the Pacific like a slow, gray tide, exposing the battlefield piece by piece. What the night had hidden, the sunrise revealed with merciless clarity. To the west, the smoldering hulks of Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu drifted aimlessly, their once proud silhouettes reduced to broken outlines against the horizon. Columns of smoke rose from their gutted decks, rising straight into the calm morning air like memorials carved from ash. The ocean around them was strangely still. No aircraft, no escorts, only debris and the quiet splash of waves against ruined steel. These ships had launched the Pearl Harbor attack only 6 months earlier. Now they lay motionless, stripped of power and purpose. Farther out, the Hiryu, the last to fall, had burned throughout the night. Her fires glowed faintly in the morning light, flickering deep inside her fractured hull. The Japanese destroyers Kazugumo and Makagumo stood by her side, taking aboard wounded sailors, gathering survivors, preparing for the inevitable. Aboard the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi addressed his crew with calm clarity. He ordered evacuations. He thanked them for their courage. And then, in a decision that stunned even his officers, he refused to leave the ship. He would go down with her. Shortly after dawn, the destroyers stepped back. Hiryu burned a little longer, then rolled quietly onto her side and slipped beneath the waves, taking Yamaguchi and many of his men with her. The heart of Japan's carrier strike force was gone. Eastward, the American fleet greeted the morning with a mixture of triumph and fatigue. The Enterprise moved steadily through calm waters, her decks busy but controlled. Pilots debriefed in hushed tones. Mechanics checked aircraft battered by dives, flak, and long hours in the air. Officers reviewed their fuel, ammunition, and search patterns. But aboard the Yorktown, dawn brought new danger. She had survived 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedoes. She had been abandoned once, then reboard. Her crew had fought through fire and flooding to keep her afloat. But fresh reports warned that Japanese submarines were operating in the area. At 6:45 a.m., the subtle rhythm of the sea was broken by an unmistakable sound. Lookouts shouting, alarms ringing, a ripple of urgency spreading across the escort ships. A Japanese submarine, I-168, had slipped through the screen. She surfaced briefly, spotted the wounded Yorktown, and launched 4 torpedoes. 2 struck the destroyer USS Hammond, splitting her in half. 2 hit Yorktown herself. The carrier shuddered. Water surged through new ruptures. The list deepened. This time, even the most determined efforts could not save her. Throughout the morning, sailors watched in silence as Yorktown settled lower in the water, her once proud deck dipping closer to the waves. By early afternoon, she rolled to port, hesitated as if resisting the inevitable, then slid beneath the surface with a long, final sigh. A single carrier lost, but 4 enemy carriers destroyed. It was an exchange few could have imagined days earlier. As the sun climbed higher, the magnitude of the American victory became undeniable. Midway Atoll itself, though scarred and burned, stood firm, its defenses battered but unbroken. Its runways, though cratered, remained usable. The American flag still flew above its wind-worn sand. For months, the Japanese Empire had expanded outward like a rising tide. But on this morning, the tide began to recede. The balance of naval air power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, was slipping away. Dawn revealed a truth no map had shown the day before. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean, and the world after Midway would never be the same. By the afternoon of June 6th, the smoke had thinned, the fires had faded, and the Pacific, so wild and violent the day before, seemed disturbingly calm. Yet beneath that calm lay the immense human and strategic cost of Midway, a cost that both navies now had to confront. For the United States, the losses were real and painful. Yorktown was gone, a veteran of Coral Sea, and now Midway, a ship whose survival had seemed almost supernatural until the sea finally claimed her. Hammond had gone down with dozens of her crew. Air groups across all 3 U.S. carriers had been shattered. Squadrons that once trained together for months were now reduced to fragments. Pilots who had fought in the morning never returned for the evening roll call. Names were read. Silence followed each one. And then a single officer would quietly mark the roster with a pencil. But the Americans also understood something else. What they gained outweighed even the heaviest loss. For Japan, Midway was a catastrophe. Not simply the loss of 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, but the annihilation of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These pilots were not just skilled, they were irreplaceable. They had trained together for decades, perfected doctrine, and formed the backbone of every major Japanese victory from China to Ceylon. Their deaths created a void Japan could never fill. On the deck of the flagship Yamato, the Japanese Naval General Staff tried to process the unthinkable. Charts were spread. Reports were read in hollow, trembling voices. No combination of numbers could soften the reality. Japan had lost the core of its offensive power in a single day. In the officers' quarters, conversations shifted from confidence to disbelief. Men who had once spoken of inevitable victory now whispered about supply shortages, industrial limits, and the terrifying resilience of American production. One admiral, reading dispatches late into the night, reportedly said only, "We have lost the war." Even if the war would continue for 3 more brutal years, Midway marked the turning point, psychological, strategic, and industrial. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory was monumental, but not intoxicating. He sent out concise, almost understated messages. "This is still the beginning. We must rebuild quickly. We must strike again." The United States Navy would grow stronger each month. The Japanese Navy would grow weaker each day. Back at Pearl Harbor, sailors lined the docks as the Enterprise and Hornet returned. Men with bandaged arms carried gear off the deck. Mechanics climbed down ladders with oil-stained uniforms. Pilots stepped onto solid ground, exhausted beyond words. There were no parades, no speeches, just quiet nods and the gravity of what had been accomplished. The defenders of Midway, too, took stock of their little island. Burned buildings. Craters across the runways. Spent casings scattered over the sand. And yet, despite the scars, the atoll stood firm. The American flag still snapped in the wind. Midway had survived. And because it survived, the Pacific would never again tilt in Japan's favor. The cost had been high. The consequences would be higher still. For both sides, the world had changed. In the weeks that followed Midway, the Pacific Ocean seemed to change personality. Where once the Japanese fleet had moved with unchecked confidence, choosing its battles, seizing territory, striking at will, it now operated with caution, hesitation, and growing fear. The loss of 4 frontline carriers was devastating. But the deeper wound lay in the collapse of Japan's naval air arm. Before Midway, Japan fielded the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. Men who had trained for years in rigorous programs, mastering gunnery, navigation, formation tactics, and the art of coordinated strikes. Many had been flying since the 1930s. Their skills were not easily reproduced. After Midway, that elite cadre was gone. Japan attempted to rebuild, but its training pipeline was too slow, its resources too thin, its industrial capacity too strained. New pilots were rushed into combat with barely half the instruction their predecessors had received. Losses mounted. Experience vanished. The sharp edge of Japan's naval sword had been permanently dulled. Meanwhile, the United States was just beginning to accelerate. Factories in California, Washington, and Michigan ramped up production of aircraft, Wildcats, Dauntless, Avengers, and soon the new Hellcats. Shipyards launched new carriers at a pace no nation in history had matched. Essex-class hulls slid into the water month after month, each one representing a surge of strength that would soon tip the balance beyond recovery. Midway had bought time, precious time, for this industrial wave to gather momentum. Strategically, the U.S. shifted from survival to initiative. Instead of reacting to Japanese moves, Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet began planning offensives of their own. The next target was already under study: Guadalcanal. Midway made it possible. Midway made it necessary. Within Japan's high command, the shock lingered like a sickness. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, withdrew into a silence that troubled those around him. He understood what few dared to say out loud. The gamble he had placed the empire upon had failed. Reports from industrial ministries were even more sobering. Steel shortages, fuel shortages, aircraft shortages. The fleet could not be rebuilt at the pace war demanded. Even if Japan launched new ships, they would never match the volume America was now capable of producing. The tide had turned. In whispered conversations within naval academies, commanders spoke of Midway as if it were a wound that would never close. They debated decisions, timing, doctrine, but all returned to the same grim truth. Japan had lost the initiative, the experience, and the strategic momentum necessary to win the war. For the United States, morale surged, but quietly. Victory brought confidence, not arrogance. The Navy understood how narrow the margins had been, how easily the battle could have swung the other way. A few minutes' delay. A different course chosen. A scout plane missing its target. Any of these might have led to disaster. Instead, timing, skill, sacrifice, and a measure of luck had converged. Midway became not just a victory, but a turning point written into the very geometry of the war. From this moment forward, the Pacific would no longer be an arena dominated by Japan. It would become a domain of American advance, relentless, industrial, and strategically decisive. Midway had opened the door. Now the U.S. Navy would walk through it. In the decades that followed the war, historians, veterans, and strategists returned again and again to a single question. How could 3 minutes decide the fate of an entire ocean? They examined charts, fuel logs, dive angles, timing sequences, every detail of the battle, searching for some deeper mechanism, some perfect geometry that explained the scale of the outcome. And yet, the answer was always the same. Midway succeeded because everything converged: courage, intelligence, sacrifice, timing, and the thin, shifting line between chaos and opportunity. For the Japanese sailors who survived, Midway remained a wound that never fully closed. Many had watched their ships burn from the water, clinging to debris as fire lit the night sky. Some spoke of the shock, the disbelief, the moment they realized the invincible Kido Butai was gone. Others remembered the faces of pilots who never returned, the finest aviators their nation had produced. For the Americans, the legacy was etched in equal parts pride and sorrow. Pilots who dove on the Japanese carriers that morning carried those memories for the rest of their lives: the glare of the sun, the scream of the dive, the sudden bloom of fire on a deck crowded with aircraft. Some recalled the terror. Others remembered only the silence afterward, the moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. And then there were the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, who flew into impossibility without hesitation. Their sacrifice broke the Japanese air defenses and opened the sky for the Dauntless to strike. Every victory that morning flowed from their courage. Their story became part of the identity of the U.S. Navy itself. By war's end, the Pacific was a different ocean. American carriers, larger, faster, more numerous, dominated the waves. Amphibious forces pushed westward, island by island. Japan retreated on every front, its naval power broken beyond repair. And when the USS Missouri lay anchored in Tokyo Bay in 1945, accepting Japan's surrender, the echoes of Midway were still present, faint but unmistakable. The battle had not ended the war, but it had determined how the war would end. Today, the map of the Pacific looks nothing like it did in June 1942. Shipping lanes, trade routes, alliances, and borders all trace faint shadows of the decisions made in those crucial days. Military academies still study Midway, not as myth, but as proof that war is shaped not only by strength, but by insight, risk, and the courage to act in the moment opportunity appears. And somewhere in that vast expanse of blue water, beneath thousands of meters of silence, lie the remains of the carriers that once defined the power of an empire. Kaga, Akiji, Soryu, Hiryu. Their twisted frames rest in the darkness, monuments to a day when the Pacific changed direction. Above them, the ocean moves as it always has. Waves rise and fall. Wind crosses the surface. Storms sweep the horizon. But the legacy of Midway remains, quiet, enduring, undeniable. A reminder that in war, as in history, sometimes the smallest sliver of time, 3 minutes of fire, can rewrite the destiny of nations.